This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. If a tool existed that would reduce negative encounters with wildlife in your municipality, would you implement it? I think most listeners to this podcast would. And a new toolkit is available that can actively help residents do just that. The Wildlife Attractant By-law Toolkit was developed by Serratus Wildlife Services for the Get Bear Smart Society. It's a comprehensive document that can help municipalities across Canada, particularly those in British Columbia, easily and affordably introduce attractant management bylaws. Such bylaws act as an educational tool as well as an enforcement option and can improve outcomes for wildlife by identifying and treating a core issue, attractant management. To explain the toolkit, why bylaws are an essential tool for municipalities, and what it can look like for residents or community leaders to use the document, Defender Radio was joined by toolkit author Meg Toom of Serratus Wildlife Services. I wanted to talk a little bit about what bylaws are before we dive into the bylaw toolkit, before we dive into how people can use them and why they're important and all of that. I think there's a lot of folks out there who maybe just don't have the experience to understand sort of where bylaws exist, why they exist, and how they can be used. So could you tell us a little bit, just sort of in general, about municipal bylaws?
Yeah, so for sure, there's a lot of kind of gray areas. And you know, let's be honest, it's not the most interesting topic for some. It's, I say the word bylaw and I get this glazed look and everybody's kind of, but bylaws are crucial, local regulations. They reflect a community's overall principles, and they're meant to evolve as a community changes. So, you know, bylaws are often revised based on the needs that are changing within the community. And they're living documents. They should be reviewed. They should be updated as needs change. So essentially, you know, all municipalities have within their websites just the list of all the existing bylaws. You've got anywhere from noise bylaws. Obviously, we're going to talk about wildlife attractant bylaws, tree cutting bylaws, soil removal. There's all sorts of, you know, they are rules and regulations to kind of keep things copacetic for everybody within a community. We're all doing the same thing.
I've also found that bylaws are probably the most effective way to make change for most individuals. If you're looking for something to happen in your community, or you need some kind of regulation put in place, or you believe there needs to be one, it is a lot, I should say, in my experience, it can be significantly more straightforward to get a bylaw put in place than to try and deal with a provincial or federal government, in which the process for creating legislation is significantly more in-depth and can have much further reaching consequence or impact as well than a local bylaw.
Right. And to that point, you know, as I was saying before, each community, each municipality or regional district, whatever you're dealing with, is unique, is individual. And so being able to kind of set their own guidelines for how they want things to happen within their own community is crucial. And a well-written bylaw is, to me, a huge educational tool. So if it's well written and people can read it and understand it and kind of get a sense of, okay, well, I've moved to this new community and now I understand why they have this, and this bylaw, because this is what's important to them and this is what we need to regulate and kind of keep an eye on. So it must be, and this is the kind of the whole point of putting together this toolkit, is because we want bylaws to be easy to read for the general public, so they can read through it and understand it, and not just abide by it, but also understand why it's there. It kind of helps to define a community, what their bylaws are.
Absolutely. And it's also a way of making significant social change. But it's a process that you really can access as a citizen. You can really have an impact, and it can be something that is laser precision, or it can be relatively broad. And I think that kind of leads us to then what this Bear Toolkit is, or maybe what the need for it was. Why did we decide we had to put this together? And by we, of course, I mean not me at all, but the Get Bear Smart Society and Serratus Wildlife Services.
Yes, absolutely. So essentially, you know, I've been doing wildlife conflict the area of the field of wildlife conflict for over 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I've amended and revised a few bylaws along the way. And the emails and the phone calls that I would get from other communities saying, hey, we've got this problem. We've got bears accessing garbage. We've got people putting out bird feeders. We've got an issue. And it was mainly focusing on bears for sure. But, this toolkit will help with other wildlife, not just bears, but we'll focus on bears for the purposes of this conversation. And there was just such a need out in the general, and I was getting calls from, the states, not just within BC, within Canada and within the States, just people trying to figure out how can we do things better, because bears are being killed because of accessing, no fault of their own, accessing food that people are leaving out for them. And so it becomes, obviously a public safety concern, but obviously, we should be protecting, conserving the wildlife that we share the landscape with. So a lot of the communities within BC are interested in what the provincial government has. It's called the Bear Smart program, which, can be more for other communities, doesn't necessarily have to be just BC specific. But many communities are struggling with wildlife conflict and issues. So trying to create a toolkit for people. And funnily enough, I got an email 2 days ago from a community member, and I believe this person's on a volunteer organization. And he's just really struggling with the fact that they've got a lot of bears in town. They're getting into a lot of garbage. And they don't seem to have a council who's particularly interested or motivated to make changes. And also from a financial perspective, they're thinking, this is just too much. We can't take this on. So I emailed him the toolkit and said, hey, take a look through this. It kind of will help you get a better sense of why you need a bylaw, how you can possibly approach your council to convince them that a bylaw is necessary, because they don't have anything in place.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of the background on why we thought this was necessary and why bylaws are important and what the issue is.
And it's interesting to me, and I am familiar with this situation, but if you could talk a bit about the resistance that can occur, because in my experience, in Ontario, BC, Alberta, wherever, municipalities will very quickly say, well, wildlife is a provincial issue, therefore we're not going to touch it, and we just need the province to do their thing. And that is sometimes the attitude, and sometimes not that direct, but wildlife has been a provincial mandate. So why or what leads to that kind of disagreement, and is a bylaw something that can help bridge that gap?
Sure. So we do hear that quite often. Municipalities are reluctant to, as they consider, manage wildlife. And of course, it is a provincial responsibility to manage the actual wildlife, but it is a municipal or local government responsibility to manage the wildlife attractants that bring the wildlife into the community. So it's a shared responsibility. No, we're not asking the municipality to manage the wildlife. That's the province's responsibility. But what we are asking them to do is to step up and manage the attractants that are bringing the wildlife in. It's all very preventable. And so trying to shift that kind of lens to, yeah, we are part of the problem. We are the huge part of the problem. So how do we manage that? And as we stated in the toolkit, local government, they have many rules and regulations to protect public safety. And this is just another kind of cog in the wheel for protecting public safety and also conserving and protecting the wildlife. But it is definitely the crux of the matter is humans are intentionally and unintentionally feeding wildlife.
And this then provides, as you mentioned earlier, and I'm not sure if we were recording it, but you had noted that a bylaw is a great educational tool. And I 1,000% agree with that. And I'll often say the same thing. Could you talk a bit about how, because I think that the concern for some elected officials is, well, you're giving me a hammer to solve this problem, and I don't want to use a hammer, right? They see enforcement or fining as a negative. It may not be good for re-election time. There's residents who maybe are not able to pay financially. It could be a hardship. There's a lot of, I think, fair and not necessarily fair pushback on that. So could you speak a bit about the educational value, too, of having these bylaws in place?
For sure. And as I said earlier, that a well-written bylaw, one that can be comprehended by the average person, because sometimes they can be quite highfalutin with legalese kind of, and it just goes right over someone's head. So if it's well written, it can be used as an educational tool, absolutely. And it has to have a level of reasonableness so that the enforcement personnel are able to go in and educate themselves. So typically, and all the bylaw enforcement officers that I've ever worked with, gaining voluntary compliance is the priority. Trying to get that human to understand what they need to do, how they need to change their behaviors to make things work better, is their top priority. They don't want to issue a ticket if they don't necessarily have to, because of the comments you made about some people just can't afford to pay the ticket. And oftentimes, if you can get someone to change their behavior willingly, independently on their own, then you're going to have more success than if you hit them with a hammer and a fine, because they're going to be resentful. And they, some people can't afford the fines and they will continue to pay the fine because they don't care. They're not going to change their behavior. So that's why bylaws are so important to be used as an educational tool to help motivate people to understand what they're doing, how it's not working, what we need to do to make you in compliance with the bylaw, and how we can do that without having to issue the fine. Having said that, having the fines associated with the bylaw are the teeth for bylaw enforcement, should they not be gaining voluntary compliance. So education. And so once you write a bylaw and get your communications team involved, it's a great way for them to just educate the community that, hey, we have a new bylaw in place. This is what we've done. This is why we're doing it. This is where we need your help as a community to make it a success. And, again, well written so that I sat in on an adjudication process a few years back, and there were about 8 or 9 folks there who had been issued tickets or notices. And a lot of them were just saying, I didn't understand when I read through what I had done wrong and I went and referred to the bylaw. I didn't get it.
Yeah.
So we went back and we revised that bylaw and we broke it down into sequential steps so that it was very clear, and we removed any kind of arbitrary kind of wording so that it was very, very well spoken and clear.
When we talk about enforcement, as we said, there's a lot of pushback on it. There's people who don't want to impose a fine. There's people who think that it's inappropriate for a government at all to be sort of forcing them into any behaviors. Okay. So what are tools we could use, or what are concepts we can use even to just sort of maybe soften that a little bit? So right before we hit that nail on the head with the hammer, we go, you're going to be okay, by the way.
Yeah. No, it's, again, back to the whole voluntary compliance. If the bylaw is well written and we can use it as an educational tool, the other key element to implementing a new bylaw is having an education program. And there are a lot of volunteer organizations. There's also Safe BC that does educational programs within different communities. So when you have this kind of bylaw, especially a new bylaw, a standalone bylaw created, it's always helpful, very helpful to have an education program part of it, so that you give a lead up. You let people know we're implementing this new bylaw. We're going to be doing education. We're going to be going door to door, canvassing, checking on garbage cans to make sure people are in compliance. Education, your first little door hanger you get or sticker on your garbage can is basically education. It's and then, eventually over time, we're going to build up, and they'll be getting out some warnings. And then obviously, if that's not working, then tickets will be. So it's a staggered approach. You ease people in, you do a lot of education and, like you said, messaging through social media. And then, and it's up to each individual enforcement officer to determine whether or not that person's being reasonable or not. So creating a reasonable bylaw that's easy for enforcement personnel to actually enact is crucial. If it's too prescriptive, it pigeonholes them and they don't have a lot of discretion. But if you make it too general, then it gets confusing for the person who's reading it and trying to comply. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
So it's a very fine line, but you have to have an excellent education component to the bylaw. And you have to have, tie that in really well with your enforcement team. So it's a partnership, and then bringing that into the community as this whole program that we're starting. And you're part of the solution, like help us, help you to do the right things. We're all on this together, kind of thing.
And I think that's always got to be the attitude when we talk about wildlife and we talk about the environment, because it's so easy to say that's not my issue or I'm not the problem, right? It's easy to just redirect very frequently in some of these because the bears aren't having a voice that is being listened to or picked up by media in the way that we would like. I won't say they don't have a voice. We just don't listen to it very well. In the toolkit, there's a couple of parts I'd love to touch on briefly. One is that you include the First Nation bylaw considerations. So one of the, there's a couple of bits of background and stuff, but then right at the top, this is something that's going to be unique to a lot of different regions across Canada. Why is this an important consideration? And is it something that requires a lot of specialty? Or is it something that most communities will be able to manage on their own?
Great question. So with the community that I worked within for many years, had obviously a First Nation component, and we had wildlife working group meetings, and we had a First Nation representation during those meetings, and we worked very closely with them. However, they did not have a wildlife attractant bylaw, and wildlife. They utilize the landscape irrespective of jurisdictions. So when you've got multi-jurisdictional communities, it's important for everybody to be doing the same thing. So that's why we thought it obviously very important to include a First Nation consideration within the bylaw toolkit, because First Nation reserves can absolutely have their own wildlife attractant bylaws. And that just, again, everybody working together to the same cause. It's crucial.
And I think too, it's for a lot of communities. And I think of Southern Ontario, which is much different in that regard. It's also a great opportunity to engage other communities that maybe we don't normally.
Absolutely. And the First Nation in the community that I worked with, they actually went ahead and built a wildlife-proof enclosure for one of their new townhouse complexes, which was just absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
So, leaps and bounds ahead of what we were doing. So it was just, again, a shared responsibility that we all took really seriously, and the collaboration was awesome. So absolutely, like I said, wildlife just moved through the landscape. They don't care.
Yep. I am always tickled when people say, well, I've got a fence and there's still raccoons coming in. It's like, well, why do you think they're like, did you make it a 24-foot domed fence with plastic all over it or something? Anyway, I think that's one of those little expectations need to be aligned at times as well.
Right.
So going through the table of contents again, just sort of as the base talking point, you include in this a lot of basic information and then a comprehensive sample bylaw, as well as a guide to that sample bylaw. And I found that very helpful for me. So again, I have some familiarity with bylaws and legalese and the policy process, but it's still helpful to have the explanation of what the parts are. And it almost makes me think of, if you've seen these in for students, for Shakespeare, it has the original text and then it has what they're actually saying next to it. Because it's cool if you can stand up there and deliver it.
What the what?
Yeah, sometimes you just need to know what whitherto ever means. And they say it just means, oh, that guy, whenever. So is that sort of the same intent here, just to make sure?
Absolutely. Because like I said, people, when they read bylaws, it's like puts them to sleep. And also you get that glazed look and that kind of, what? So what we did was just the introduction of why we need the bylaws and considerations for people. And then we went into, let's give people an actual sample bylaw. This is the dream bylaw, right? Mm-hmm. This is probably a lot more than what most municipalities would want to take on board initially. So in the community I used to work with, implemented their first wildlife attractant bylaw in 2004, and it was very, very basic, but it was a great start. Mm-hmm. Then within a few years, by 2009, we revised it because the community changed, our knowledge of what was going on changed, and then just recently in 2021, it was revised again because of, again, we learned new things. So providing this sample bylaw, like I said, it's very comprehensive, and then we then broke it down, like you said, step-by-step guide. Each section of the bylaw we tried to explain. special considerations based on each community's needs, what you might want to add, what you might want to eliminate.
And I think it's such a great way of setting that information up for folks so that they can easily access it and understand it. There is one element of this that is often, I think, contentious and often probably one of the more difficult parts of attractant management to talk about is bird feeders. So bird feeders, I mean, like we've got the avian flu outbreak in Southern Ontario right now, like everyone else. And all of the stores are still selling their 80-pound bags of bird seed and bird feeders and all of that stuff with no notices. It is a very difficult seed to crack, for the sake of a segue. Is there a way to write in sort of a variable on bird feeders? Because again, in bear country, bird feeders are frequently a problem. When you don't necessarily have large mammals around, it can still be a big problem, but a much less visible one. And therefore, I have found a lot of communities, they're willing to talk about wildlife feeding, they're willing to talk about attractants, but they want some kind of context, or they want some kind of variable switch with the bird feeders. Is there a way to approach that will kind of make everybody happy, or does it have to be at times a black or white situation?
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure. So some communities actually outright ban bird feeders during bear season. So March to November, so not allowed bird feeders. That's pretty black and white.
Yeah.
That gives you the exact guidelines, easy to read, easy to understand, hopefully easy to comply with. And typically birds, if they're going to be fed, they require the feeding more over the winter than they do over the spring, summer, and fall months. Then you have also hanging. So what we put in there, and it sounds quite gray, is it must be, a bird feeder must be made inaccessible.
Okay.
And how a person does that is basically up to them. But then the education component of that is, then there should be something on the municipality's website saying, it has to be hung at least 10 feet off the ground and 10 feet away from a climbable structure. That gives guidelines on how high and how far away it needs to be done, so it's out of reach of a bear standing on its back legs. But what it does do, by being quite general, by saying the bird feeder must be inaccessible, is it provides the enforcement personnel to use discretion on what they consider to be accessible or inaccessible.
Yeah.
If it's too prescriptive, then it becomes, it becomes difficult to enforce. The other key element to bird feeders is the requirement they must include a seed catch tray.
Yeah.
Because the seeds drop into the ground, and that's when so a neighbor of mine has a bird feeder out. I think they've removed it now because they've obviously heard about the issue with bird feeders and the avian flu. They had a bird feeder just on one of those stands that's, you stick it into the ground, a pole. They had a couple suet feeders and bird feeders hanging from it. So it was about maybe 4 feet off the ground. And underneath it, they had a rat trap. So they were creating a food chain.
Yeah.
So instead of putting a catch tray underneath to catch the seeds, they were killing the rats.
Yeah,
the rats were coming to feed you can't blame the rat for coming for the food. Yep. Why don't you put a catch tray underneath? And the community I'm living in right now does not require that. It's pretty general. And I think every community should include the catch tray at least, because that just creates a whole food chain in your neighborhood.
I have seen a few bird feeders, and I swear they're like short gopher feeders or something. They are not even a foot off the ground, 6 inches from touching the grass. And I see that, and I understand, so, well, they don't want to get a big post. They don't want to do this. I understand the logic behind it. But I look at that, and it's like a drive-through for every rodent in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and if you look at what happened in Stanley Park last year with the Coyote Situation, I mean, I took a walk through there one day, and there were people walking around the lake with a Ziploc bag full of birdseed, and they were just throwing the seed. And then one of the bridges had birdseed piles all along the railing. Yes. With people taking pictures, not even thinking for a minute that they might be attracting other animals to feed. Obviously, coyotes are going to eat the rodents that go for the birdseed, plus they'll eat the birdseed themselves. So again, people are just not putting the wheels in motion to think that they're creating these food chains in their yards that maybe they think it's harmless, but obviously killing rats because you're feeding the birds.
I actually have a photo.
A knowledge gap.
Yes, I have a photo I will send you, and I'll see if I can attach to this episode somehow, of this was my old neighborhood in Hamilton. Someone would just throw pounds of bird seed out their window, and there was peanut shells everywhere. It was the corner of a major intersection with a fence up. I got a picture of a cat on the fence, like swiping at the bird feeder. And it's, again, it's one of those, if you put that out, you're feeding everybody. You're not just feeding the birds. And arguably, when you feed the birds, you can be causing harm, especially, avian influenza is one example. But a lot of that food is not good quality. It's not good for birds or other wildlife. And I've heard bird feeders referenced in terms of bears as just like, it's like a high-fat, high-calorie protein ball, effectively, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
It's just a great snack for them.
Sunflower seeds, lots of fat. And you typically see when bears are coming out of hibernation in the spring, when a lot of bears getting into bird feeders. And people think that might be harmless, but it's just attracting them into residential neighborhoods. And that never ends well for the bear. Never. So we need to, again, put the wheels in motion, connect what our actions to the big picture. And that's why having this bylaw that covers off all of these different attractants that many people just don't make the connection to, that this is a bad thing. The other thing is fruit trees.
Yes.
People just say, well, that's okay. I don't care if a bear eats my cherries or my apples, but I think these are domestic fruit trees. They are not wild. They are in your front or backyard. They are allowing wildlife to come into your yard. Creates a public safety concern. And like I said, typically when bears enter neighborhoods, it never really ends well for them. So the original bylaw that I worked on many years ago required the resident to remove fruit from the ground every 3 days.
Yeah, that's a good one. And
that became a nightmare to enforce, if you can imagine.
Well, I find
how do you enforce that?
But what's fascinating, and I've heard about this in some communities, there's volunteer programs that will go out and collect the fruit because it's edible food. And we've got people who don't have enough food. Therefore, there's a real simple solution here. Spend a couple of days a month going out and picking some fruits and letting a local food bank know, or donating it, or enjoying it yourself. Right? Fruit's good for us. Some. In the right
just
quality.
Research what your community, absolutely. Research what your community has. The other thing that we did, because we did have a fruit picking program, but we actually had, it was meant for more for people who just were physically unable to pick the fruit, that it became a bit of a crutch for some folk who, I remember going to one house, I was fortunately, and the family was sitting inside the house having supper, watching me pick their tree. And so I thought, something's wrong with this situation. So what we tried to do with social media is connect people. So there's a food exchange program now on a Facebook page. So if someone's got some apples ripening, hey folks, come by my place. This is the address. Pick your fruit.
That's awesome.
So it's again, connecting people. We can all be a part of the solution. But the whole fruit thing is, there's this misnomer that fruit trees are natural food for bears, and it's not. It's domestic fruit. And so what we did in the bylaws is just made it very kind of, again, somewhat general, that the fruit on the trees and the bushes has to be made inaccessible. How you go about doing that is up to you. And it's up to the bylaw enforcement office to determine whether your actions are reasonable or not, whether you actually are trying to manage that attractant. And so you could put up an electric fence if you want to, like a portable electric fence. The portable fence goes around the tree while it's ripening. Once they've harvested the fruit, you can pack away the electric fence till next season. So picking the fruit and let it ripen inside, or knocking off some of the blossoms in the spring so you don't have so much of a harvest. Pruning the tree so it's smaller, shorter, more manageable to harvest, because you get these trees that are just ginormous. The top to pick the apples, except the bear.
That actually, I had that conversation with my partner. She used to have a fruit tree, and I said, "Oh, I'd love to get one." She said, "But the problem was it would get so tall, you would never be able to get to the fruit in time, and then hornets or wasps or whatever would come and desiccate them, and then you just have junk all over the ground." But that was my thought: was, okay, well, what if every week we just get out with the step ladder and prune it to get no taller than 8 feet? Just every time it hits that mark, we go snip or saw and push it out wider to make it more accessible for us. But I think there's lots of solutions for that kind of stuff. And it's cool that the bylaws can incorporate that. I think it's so important. Though that does lead to the final question I have on the bylaws themselves, and that is the costs. So municipalities, probably more so than the provincial or federal government, are a lot worried about balancing books, about not overspending, about not going into deficits, because I think it can have a lot more dire impact a lot faster than it can at the provincial or federal level. If there is resistance because they don't want to spend the money on bylaw officers, or they don't think that it's worth it, is there sort of I'm not going to say a built-in argument, but a common response to that to try and just sort of move away from this, it costs money, so it can't be doable?
Yeah, so what we've kind of outlined in this toolkit is creating a standalone bylaw might be a bit overwhelming for a municipality. This is the first time they've ventured down the road of wildlife attractant bylaws. And so that's why we've provided the sample bylaw, so you can just cut and paste bits of it into existing bylaws. And that it doesn't need a lot of money to do. And that's why we've made it hopefully very simple for people to do that. So a lot of communities go in and they take their solid waste or recycling bylaw, and they'll take snippets and just amend that bylaw by adding in a few clauses about when your garbage cans can go out and how they must be stored and inaccessible. Sometimes they'll actually add a little bit in there about bird feeders or whatever. A standalone bylaw is definitely more preferable than amending an existing bylaw, an actual standalone wildlife attractant bylaw. But now that we've given this one, it should simplify the process, and it shouldn't be onerous, and it should not be financially unfeasible to create a standalone bylaw. It's basically, you do need some legal oversight, and all municipalities have that.
Yep.
But essentially, it's there for people to take and use, so that it's not financially onerous or staff time wise.
To get your free copy of the Wildlife Attractant By-law Toolkit, follow the links in this week's show notes or download it at bearsmart.com. You can connect with Meg Toom via LinkedIn. Links are in the show notes. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'd love to hear what you thought of this and other episodes. Rate and review Defender Radio and The Switch on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to help even more people learn about wildlife and coexistence in their communities. You can stay in touch with me by following me on Instagram @HowieMichael or on Facebook and Twitter @Defender Radio. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers. Thank you for listening.